Okay, so this is EVE Online. This is basically the beginning. And when I say basically the beginning, what I mean absolutely the beginning. This is the character creation screen. You start with 4 empires to explore. As far as I am aware, they're pronounced Kaldari, Minmatar, Amar, and Galente. The Kaldari and Galente have an interesting intermixed history, as do the Amar and Minmatar. The Kaldari and Galente came from the same solar system. Eventually, the Galente basically financially exploited the Kaldari until the Kaldari rebelled. The Galente drove them out. Now they exist as 2 separate empires. The Galente is hypothetically a fairly liberal federation. The Kaldari is essentially a corporate state run completely by, I think it's 7 companies. Conversely, the Amar started in their own system. The Minmatar started in their own system. And I'll go into what started means in a little bit. However, the Amar were the first of all 4 of these to get to interstellar spaceflight. EVE actually has a long, complicated history of how the different forms of spaceflight evolved among the different playable races. Amar were the first ones, I believe the Galente were the first to get to warp speed. The Amar were the first to get to interstellar. Warp speed in EVE is not actually useful for moving between star systems. The warp speeds that you can attain, hypothetically at least, are too slow, and in game terms, just don't function to go between stars. So instead, there are interstellar gateways, and the Amar were the first to figure out, essentially to reverse engineer gateway technology. And I'll probably briefly go into where that comes from. Once they did this, they started expanding quite fervently. The Amar are the only extremely religious faction, and the Minmatar are somewhat religious. But the Amar have a religion that's based on modern Western religions, and it calls them to crusade and to conquer and to basically spread their religion. So the Amar began doing that, like good space zealots. Unfortunately for the Minmatar, they basically happened to live on a planet near the Amar, and they were slower to develop the technology of spaceflight, interstellar travel, things like that. So when the Amar found the Minmatar, they conquered and enslaved them. The Amar religion permits slavery, and of the 4 empires, the Amar are the only one where slavery is legal. In games terms, this doesn't come into effect much, except that occasionally you will see slaves as a cargo thing that NPCs in the Amar Empire want you to ship from one place to another. That's the very, very high-level summary of these. The Minmatar are based on being a tribal civilization. I guess I didn't really go into that. Like I said, it was the Kaldari that have 7 corporations. I don't remember how many Minmatar tribes there are. There's a fair number. And they united into a republic after a successful rebellion against the Amar allowed them to establish their own space. Not all of the tribes wanted to be in the republic, and so in-game, there's an area called the Great Wildlands, which is adjacent to Minmatar space, and one of the Minmatar tribes, I forget which one, essentially doesn't participate in the Minmatar civilization, and just roams the Great Wildlands in enormous ships. As far as I'm aware, those aren't an in-game thing. There's no chance encounters with Minmatar ships, but CCP, the game's creator, does occasionally use them for roleplay events. At one point, they had a bunch of Minmatar ships show up and attack the interstellar police force that these 4 empires have agreed to fund and maintain, called Concord. So it occasionally drives events, but it's not really an in-game thing. So what you do when you decide on one of these, and the decision is purely cosmetic, and we'll see that in a minute, is you then get to, yes, ignore all this. You then get to design your body. The premise behind EVE is that you are playing an immortal pilot called a capsuleer, and the way that works is that your pilot hops in this little space egg. I don't remember exactly how big it's supposed to be, like 12 meters across maybe. And they have implants in the back of your head, and we'll see that. Actually, I'll go ahead and pull that up. In the back of their head and along their spinal column. In these implants, let's see if we can remove the top. Oh, there we go. So you can see your pilot has these implants, and when your pilot gets in a capsule, essentially mechanical cables will automatically connect to each of these implants, allowing your pilot a neural interface directly with the ship that he's piloting. By default, just the capsule, but capsules are designed to be interoperable with Eve's spaceships, and so that's how you're able to pilot whatever kind of ship. When you die, the cables that are linking you to your it's colloquially called a pod, but to your capsule, essentially duplicate all of the contents of your brain. They scan your brain, they make a complete, precise map of your brain, and then they transmit that data. And that data is used to map onto a brain of a clone of your pilot somewhere else. And your original body, which has just been scanned by this thing because you are dying, your ship's about to blow up, is destroyed. And you wake up in a fresh new clone, which is an identical copy of the body you were just in. And then you hop right back out and go back into space. And that's the idea behind being a capsuleer. So at this stage, you basically get to custom design what you want your clone body to look like. When I say there's a cosmetic difference, the actual bone structures and things like that you can edit here are somewhat limited. Not nearly as much as, I believe it's the complexion. Yeah, the complexion though, and the facial shapes. So strangely, for designing your own perfect clone to inhabit for the rest of time, the way you can design it is actually quite limited depending on what bloodline you choose. Here I've chosen a Gallente male. If we go back, we can see that to play as a Gallente citizen, you can choose someone who is just ethnically Gallente, someone who is what's called Intaki, that's another major ethnicity, or someone who is called Jinmei. So these are the basically three options for the Gallente. If you switch to Caldari, you then have Severe, Achura, and I assume that's Detis, but I really don't know. So each of these different nations essentially has a number of predominant genetic lines in it, and you choose to play a character who's one of those. Depending on which you choose, you'll rapidly be able to see the customization that you can choose for your clone is quite limited. Here we have I believe it's just base Amarian male. And we'll see that I can't really control enough of the facial details to make him look even remotely like the Gallente character. The Gallente male looks, like a young man, early 20s. The Amarian male looks distinctly like an older man in his 50s. There is no way to play an Amarian who looks like he's in his early 20s. And if you want to play a Galentian male who looks like he's in his early 50s, I think your best bet is trying to play with the Intaki. Most of the Intaki seem to look like they're about mid to late 30s. And there's just not very much customization you can do. So when you go to a cloning center and you say, yes, please, I would like one immortal body, what you're actually doing is saying, yes, please, I would like to select from a handful of customizable templates for immortal bodies. And then you can customize it based on the parameters for that. I generally play Galentian males. The reason for that is if I like to roleplay, especially when I play Eve, but in general, when I'm playing a game, I like to roleplay. And on that basis, I like to imagine that I'm designing my own personal immortal body. I would prefer to look like a young man in his 20s than an old man in his 50s, so I pretty consistently choose Galentian male. There's an exception. I do have a female character, even though I don't really have any interest in being a female. And that's largely just due to how many male characters I'd already created and that feeling a bit sexist, frankly. Rather than having, probably 15 male characters. So at some point, even I'm like, yes, it's time to have a female here. Anyway, so I'm going to play around with this. So hopefully we can just kind of time lapse that. You'll get a chance to see the various ways you can edit, and won't have to spend hours watching me slowly configure a character. case anyone watching this is wondering, yes, all of these things are mandatory. You do have to put shoes on your character. I don't really understand why. I can't imagine that being important for your official Capsuleer photo on I'm graduating Capsuleer school and becoming an official Capsuleer day. I don't actually know, because there's literally no way that I've ever found to get the shoes in the photo. But it is mandatory. Your Capsuleer cannot be barefoot. They don't necessarily have to have their entire chest covered. They just have to have something on there. But yeah, all of that is generally mandatory. There's a bunch of in-game items you can buy, which for some of my characters I have, that provide things like hooded robes. The MR actually can get a hooded robe by default, and they're the only one who can get that particular flavor. It is a great Palpatine robe if you want a nice Emperor Palpatine Sith looking character. The MR are great for that. Just, keep in mind you can't actually have a young one. On the next screen, you get to choose ancestry within the ancestry you've already chosen. This currently has no in-game effect. At one point, I believe these slightly modified your character's starting stats, but right now, all it is basically some neat flavor text. Naturally, if you're playing Gallente, you always go with activists, just because it's the best option. And then you choose your character name. Character names are one of a handful of things in EVE that actually have to be universally unique. You cannot use a name that anyone else has already used. So it may take me a number of tries to find some kind of permutation of what I'm going for that is available. And then it looks like there's maybe no longer a step. It used to be you would take a photo of your character somewhere between here and actually starting. But I'm not actually seeing that screen anymore. So it might just be something that you can figure once you're already in game. There is definitely a way to take new photos when you are in game, and I will try and show that later in the video, assuming I am correct and there is no longer a taking a photo step here. Yes, but I think that should be another video. So I will have a second video walking through the tutorial, just in case I haven't done it in a while. And it's entirely possible that the current tutorial is not as obvious as it could be. I know past tutorials were that way. So I will step through the tutorial in another video. This has been generally the character creation process. Hopefully you got kind of a good idea of what parts of your character can be customized, and obviously a short overview of what the different races' backgrounds are, and my complete and utter mystification as to why, when you're designing your immortal body, you have to choose within a very, very narrow range, depending on what ethnic background you want to come from. I can only assume people of a Gallente ethnic background never grow old, and that people of an Amarian ethnic background never have a childhood, which is quite puzzling and deeply irritating, because the Amarians, well, every character gets a basic free starter ship, and the Amarian starter ship is by far the coolest. The Gallente actually have the best starter ship, but the Amar is the coolest, and that I would love to be able to create an Amarian character who looked like a Gallente, but just had the Amar, or really, I would love to create a Gallente character, because of the political ramifications, who just has the Amarian starter ship, but that is not an option. What your character looked like directly correlates to very few things in game, but that is one of them.